On Tuesday, it was fire and fury. Today, it was locked and loaded.
Mr. President, what do you mean by military solutions are locked and loaded as it relates to North Korea?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We are looking at that very carefully, and I hope that they are going to fully understand the gravity of what I said. And what I said is what I mean.
For the second day in a row, President Donald Trump stood before the cameras and spoke to the press, not once, but twice each day. And rather than toning down his rhetoric as the world increasingly cringes at the thought of a restart of the Korean War with nukes, he ratcheted it up.
And this man will not get away with what he's doing, believe me. And if he utters one threat in the form of an overt threat, which, by the way, he has been uttering for years, and his family has been uttering for years, or if he does anything with respect to Guam, or any place else that's an American territory or an American ally, he will truly regret it, and he will regret it fast.
He even threw in a second country to potentially use our military in.
We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option.
Okay, so did you notice Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley standing next to the president as he spoke? National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster was there, too. And we don't know if they knew that their boss was going to talk about sending troops to Venezuela. But a Pentagon spokesperson later told Reuters, quote, the Pentagon has received no orders on a Venezuela military operation, and they referred all questions to the White House. There's been a lot of talk about the so-called axis of adults around the president, the experienced hands, many of them generals, who are supposed to keep Donald Trump on track. General John Kelly is often cited as a member of the axis of adults, and his move from Homeland Security Director to Chief of Staff was supposed to be just such a fix. And so far, Donald Trump certainly does seem to like him. Here's Donald Trump praising General Kelly today.
I think that General Kelly has brought a tremendous, he's brought something very special to the office of Chief. I call him Chief. He's a respected man. He's a 4-star from the Marines. And he carries himself like a 4-star from the Marines. And he's my friend, which is very important.
He carries himself like a general. I don't even know what that means. But according to the Washington Post, General Kelly apparently could not control what Trump would say next or how long he would keep talking. That was about the questions that Trump took Thursday. One anonymous Trump confidant told the Post, this is what General Kelly will learn very quickly, which is when you put this guy in a cage and think you're controlling him, things like this happen. Today, the White House tried to do some damage control on another Trump controversy, his statement thanking Russian President Vladimir Putin for expelling hundreds of U.S. embassy workers in retaliation for new U.S. sanctions, because it cuts down our payroll. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, quote, he was being sarcastic. But here is how her boss, the president, responded when asked about it today.
Mr. President, were you being sarcastic when you thanked Vladimir Putin for expelling 755 diplomats from Russia?
In order to reduce our payroll? Absolutely. I think you know that. I think you know that. We'll see. In fact, I was just speaking to the secretary, and we're talking about coming up with an answer. When, Rex? Tell me.
By September 1st.
By September 1st, we'll have a response. But we have reduced payroll very substantially.
Joining us now, Jonathan Alter, an MSNBC political analyst and a columnist for the Daily Beast. Ned Price, former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council and a former CIA analyst. And he's an MSNBC national security analyst. And Betsy Woodruff, politics reporter for the Daily Beast. All right, Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. I mean, Donald Trump was asked about sort of the way he speaks and how that would resonate with the American people. Let's listen to how he responded.
We have tens of millions of people in this country that are so happy with what I'm saying, because they're saying, finally, we have a president that's sticking up for our nation and, frankly, sticking up for our friends and our allies.
I mean, what I have heard in general is alarm at the way that the president has been talking, but he seems to be just looking at a happiness index about his own base.
Well, that's just his way of saying he's looking at this politically, which is if he, sounds the trumpets of war, he thinks he's going to go back up in the polls because that will appeal to his base. And generally, presidents who are in a warlike mode get more public support. So he's playing from that old playbook, but he's playing a very dangerous game, and it got worse tonight when he extended North Korean misbehavior from acts to threats. So he's now saying, essentially, if the North Koreans continue to do what they've done for many, many years, which is make these outlandish threats against the United States, that he will consider that precipitate action on the part of the United States. So, you know, we're into a very dangerous period when you have people like Leon Panetta saying that this is the most dangerous period since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. It makes it hard to take Rex Tillerson's advice and sleep well.
Well, and you know, and Ned Price, you know, the analogy to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's almost inverted. I mean, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was Kennedy who was attempting to reassure a nation that was afraid because the Russians were deciding to put, you know, nuclear weapons, you know, right off of our shores in Cuba. This is the inverse. Is North Korea somehow behaving remarkably differently to cause Donald Trump to ratchet up this rhetoric against them, or is it the American president that's behaving differently?
Well, Joy, you raise a very good point. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously there were missiles placed in Cuba, hence the crisis. But let's review what has happened this week. The president started off the week by attacking Dick Blumenthal and the failing New York Times on Twitter, and ended the week by suggesting we could be attacking Venezuela and North Korea. I admire both the New York Times and Dick Blumenthal, but I kind of wish we would be back to what the president was attacking on Monday. When it comes to North Korea, though, the important point is that there haven't been any changes with the facts on the ground. If you recall what precipitated this crisis, it was the publication of a report in the Washington Post about North Korea's alleged miniaturization of a nuclear warhead, something that presumably the president had already been briefed on in his daily intelligence briefing, the president's presidential daily brief. And yet somehow that Washington Post report precipitated this crisis that now has the president threatening nuclear war over facts on the ground that weren't any different than they were last week.
Yeah, and I mean, and in addition to that, Betsy, you now also have Donald Trump adding Venezuela to the menu. This is sort of a completely out of left field threat to use military force in Venezuela. We now have then tonight the White House issuing a statement saying essentially that Donald Trump had refused a phone call that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, had wanted to have with him. How did Venezuela get on the menu? It is truly out of left field.
I think part of the reason for this is that the president's default is to threaten to use the military anytime he sees a problem happening that he's not sure how to solve. Remember, in the past, he's threatened to send, quote unquote, the feds into Chicago, hinting sort of ominously at the possibility of martial law. No one took that threat seriously for understandable reasons, but it was a threat he was comfortable making. And in the same way, he's hinted about sending the feds or sending the military to the border to try to deal with people crossing the border illegally. His default is to pivot to the military, to pivot to some sort of military solution. I think that's part of why he likes generals so much. Part of why his default, when his own White House was sort of turning into a bit of an omni-shambles, was to bring in a four-star general, somebody with that military credibility. The question here then becomes not so much necessarily why is the president bringing up the military all the time, as should people and can people take the president of the United States seriously when he threatens military action? In the past, over the course of his presidency, he's been sort of on and off about whether or not he follows through on those threats. Republicans hit Obama hard when he didn't follow through all the way, when he drew a red line in Syria. The question now becomes, do Republicans hit Trump in the same way when he doesn't follow through on the plethora of military threats that he's so comfortable making?
Yeah, there's you know, the accusation that Barack Obama didn't threaten to use military force enough. Donald Trump is threatening it for everything. And Ned, I have to come to you back on this because there is this weird dichotomy inside of Trump world. You have him having run with these alt-righters like Steve Bannon, who ostensibly would only want to do military strikes if they use, you know, mercenaries, right? They don't want to increase military action. You have people like Sebastian Gorka, who was a blogger for Breitbart, now on the U.S. payroll. This was him talking about Rex Tillerson, who's the Secretary of State, and saying, don't listen to him. This was him on BBC Radio.
You should listen to the president. The idea that Secretary Tillerson is going to discuss military matters is simply nonsensical. It is the job of Secretary Mattis, as Secretary of Defense, to talk about the military options. And he has done so unequivocally today. He said, woe betide anyone who militarily challenges the United States, and that is his portfolio, that is his mandate. Secretary Tillerson is the chief diplomat of the United States.
I mean, Ned, are there enough adults in the axis of adults to rein in that kind of influence on the president?
Well, I'm not sure about that, Joy, but what you have in the form of Sebastian Gorka is an individual who is consistently first in line at the White House cafeteria because he has little else to do during the day, attacking the person who's fourth in line to the presidency of the United States, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State. The fact of the matter is that Sebastian Gorka accrues a U.S. government salary of $155,000 a year. And you talk to anyone on the NSC, any professional staff member on the NSC, none of them can tell you what Sebastian Gorka does. And in fact, it's been reported that Sebastian Gorka doesn't even have a security clearance, precluding him from sitting in on any of these sort of national security meetings. You know, President Trump, sarcastic or not, earlier this week thanked President Putin for cutting down the U.S. government payroll. There seem to be about 155,000 reasons for letting Sebastian Gorka go from the White House, in addition to the fact that he seems to do very little for our national security.
Well, in addition to that, you then have this memo, and I'll just really quickly on this, Jonathan, you're laughing. This memo from an NSC official was fired because of it. Rich Higgins, talking about Marxists and, cultural memes and deep state actors and globalists attacking the president. I mean, that is what is going into Donald Trump's brain.
Yeah, he read the memo after Donald Trump Jr. sent it to him.
Who shouldn't have had it.
Just in terms of Gorka, if this had been any other administration, Rex Tillerson would be calling the president and saying, I want that guy out, and he would be fired. And so it's kind of peculiar to me that Tillerson is putting up with this kind of guff from Gorka. But in terms of this memo, this goes to the very heart of their worldview, their kind of paranoid worldview that not only are bankers, quote,
right.
Code Jewish bankers, and Democrats and Maoists, they're actually in the memo.
Yeah.
But establishment Republicans
are out to get them.
That's their worldview.
Very quickly, Betsy, we're out of time, but then why is it that the people who seem to be in danger of their jobs are people like McMaster?
Because they don't necessarily feed into the president's bunker mentality. The president feels like he's constantly under assault, like he's constantly being threatened. When adults, members of this so-called axis of adults like McMaster, remind him that he's the president of the United States, he's the most powerful person in the world, that doesn't fit into his personal narrative, it doesn't fit into his Twitter narrative, and the result is that it's not advice that he necessarily wants to hear.
Doesn't, and that's all he wants, what he wants to hear. Ned Price, Betsy Woodruff, thank you guys both.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.